There we go. Sorry about that. So today, we are continuing in Luke chapter 5. For the last few weeks, we've been looking at the stories we find in Luke chapter 5. And we began with Jesus calling disciples. And we've seen Jesus go on to move forward in doing healing. And he is teaching so that people can hear and then choose to follow. And we see him inviting those disciples to join him in that process of being part of the healing and following ministry in the same way. And as we ended last time, he's getting criticized by the Pharisees and other religious leaders. And we try to make clear that Pharisee is more of a general group who would have cared deeply, would have been deeply sincere. There wouldn't have been anything necessarily wrong with that. The challenge was they were coming from a very narrow view compared to what Jesus is trying to present. And those who are in power are deeply questioning. We use the illustration, and we're not going to revisit it all, but they're people of a shallow box. They've got shallow boxes of what God is, what the Bible is, what they're supposed to be, about how to figure out who's good and who's bad and who's in and who's out. And Jesus is blowing up some of those boxes in such a way that it's hard for them to cope, and they're going to have that problem again. Because as we got to the end of last time, Jesus doesn't just call a tax collector to be one of his followers. He goes and has a big meal with the tax collector and other tax collectors and others that they'd consider unclean, others that they consider less than. That they, as those who are serious legal scholars and followers of the rules, are somehow superior to and separate from this group of people who are both spiritually and physically unclean. And that Jesus, in all of his healings, is not just helping a body get better, eyes begin to see, but is reconnecting the people, recognizing that they were not less than in the first place. This wasn't a punishment based on them being bad. And yet that's the way the culture had embraced and had even assigned how God must feel about them. And so we get to the part where we're about to be in verse 33, and Jesus has been criticized. What are you doing eating with these people, drinking with these people, going into their home and being around the table? How dare you make yourself unclean by being around these unclean people? And Jesus makes it really clear. My mission is not to those who think they're so superior they never get sick. My mission is not those who think themselves so righteous that they don't need any healing or growing or changing or following. Mine is not to those who think they're so superior and separate from everyone else that they don't need anything from God. Mine is for those who recognize that very need. That they are the loved children of God, but they are yet to be fully whole. They're yet to know what full oneness is. They haven't lived in love, they've lived in unlove, and they're still reacting to that unlove. And that's why I'm here, and that's what I'm doing. We get to verse 33, and this group of the shallow box continues to ask. They said to him, to Jesus, John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours, they go on eating and drinking. They're not really talking about the disciples. They're wondering why Jesus is not a better teacher. Why is Jesus not a better rabbi? Why does Jesus not require more? Why are those who are considered his disciples so slack? Why don't they fast? Why don't they pray? How is it that they're gluttons and drunkards and they with all the bad people? They're not really criticizing the disciples. The disciples are just doing exactly what their teacher is doing. They're criticizing Jesus. But part of it comes from a frame of thinking of the shallow box that was, if you're a disciple, if you're somebody who's chosen to follow a religious teacher, if you're a disciple of a Pharisee, then no doubt you're more committed than other people. And you're more talented than other people. And you care about God more than other people. And part of that is reflected by the fact that you already on purpose, and everybody knows it, fast a couple of times a week. You are the better prayers of the group. And that John, who is leading a revival of Jewish folks being ready for whatever God's doing next in a Messiah that's to come. John's taking on that same kind of discipline. And so before Jesus is hitting the scene, John has disciples, and those disciples also are following this same commitment of fasting and praying. And Jesus is about to say there's nothing wrong with that. Fasting has its purpose, prayer has its purpose, but you're missing what it means to practice these things. And so Jesus' response we find in verse 34. Jesus answered, "Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he is with them?" That may go right over our heads if we're not really in tune with kind of the culture of the day. The idea would be that weddings are a big, big, big deal. And if you're the groom, the wedding really in the old days, old ancient days, was more about the groom. The bride being handed off to the groom. The groom arriving meant the wedding was going to begin. The groom being there was whose family it was mainly about, who was hosting the party, who was making it special. And the friends of the groom wouldn't come to a wedding and then sit around and not eat and not drink in order to prove they're holy. The whole point of the wedding is to celebrate the joy of the groom, who we're friends with. And so Jesus asked them, like, you're saying that the disciples, there's some problem here because they're not fasting and praying. But do you understand that the disciples are my friends? That's the relationship we have. And I'm the bridegroom and I'm with them right now. So why, while I'm present, while we're in love and in connection with one another, why wouldn't we celebrate? Why would eating and drinking be wrong? As a matter of fact, eating and drinking would be the practice that seems most right. Why in the world would you do it differently? It reminds me of a personal experience that maybe helps us take this a little more. Some of you, I've shared this, some of the parts of the story with you, but Sherry and I, we dated the last half of our senior year in college, and by the end of that time and when we graduated, we weren't really ready to fully commit our lives to each other yet, and she took a job opportunity in Jacksonville, Florida, and I took a job opportunity in Indianapolis, Indiana. And by December, we got engaged. But from December to the following August, we were waiting to get married. That was because I earned one day of vacation for every month worked, and until I could get to August, I didn't have enough vacation I could save up so that we could go on a honeymoon. It wasn't because we wanted to be in 100-degree heat in Georgia to get married, but it was because that's when we could make it work. But as, fresh and spry and young as I look, we're old enough that during that time, there were no cell phones. We had landlines. There was no internet. We weren't exchanging text. We weren't making FaceTime calls. We also, you might remember this, didn't make long-distance calls because they cost as much as a car. And so for those 8 months, Sherry and I saw each other only a couple of times because we couldn't take vacation, or at least I couldn't. And when we did, that required me driving from Indianapolis to Atlanta on a Friday night after work, Sherry driving from Jacksonville, Florida to Atlanta after work. I go 8 hours, she goes about 6.5 hours. We met at my parents' house. Kiss, kiss, hug, hug, go to sleep. We're going to see you in the morning. Because everybody wants to have breakfast with us. And then we had to get in the car and drive to LaGrange to see her family. And then we drove back and went to church. And then we had lunch. And then we went our separate ways. That was our whole time. Now, in order to make this whole thing work, in preparation for this wedding and this life together, the options were minimal, but the options that we took were to write letters to each other. I made a commitment to her. Again, this is just a thing I did. It's not, but just so you have some idea of how much this was a practice for us, I made a commitment to write her 100 times in the last 100 days before we got married. Thank you. We're going to see that that's not the point, right? But I did. It was important because it was a way, while we were separate from one another, to give our hearts to one another, to think about our futures together, to prepare ourselves for this one day of oneness in the future. Now think about how crazy it would have been that on one of those few occasions where I drove 8 hours and she drove 6 hours and we had about a day and a half to be together, that we got to my mom and dad's house and said, hey, you go down in the basement and I'm going to go over to this bedroom and let's write more letters. No, we're physically right here. Like, let's make the most of seeing each other and feeling each other's warmth and talking to each other. Why would that make any sense? And Jesus is saying the same thing, like there's nothing wrong with fasting. But in this moment, when I'm with them, in this moment, when there is love and joy in this moment, why would we do any other practice than what we're doing in order to prove that we're better than everybody else because Jay wrote a bunch of letters? That's not the point. I wasn't writing letters to one day tell a story about it. I wasn't writing letters to one day be like, at least look how romantic he was. Like, that wasn't the point. The point was, I miss you, and I don't know what we're doing with this life. But I want to take this next 8 months and do whatever I can do for us to keep connecting our hearts and our lives. And this is what we'll do as a practice, not because letter writing was the point, but because the relationship was the point. Because the life ahead was the point. And so Jesus says, why would you do that with the bridegroom? Verse 35, but a time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days, they will fast. Like there'll be a moment when it's apart. And had Sherry and I, we still gave each other cards for certain events. There were still some times when we had to be apart for work and we might touch base on it. But there was no reason to write a letter every day once we'd married each other and we were living in a little apartment together. Because there's the practices that make sense in the moment. And there's the practices that don't make any sense and are then just trying to impress. Jesus is all for the practices of our faith, but with purpose behind it. And with that purpose not being about who's superior and who's less, who's separate and good, who's bad. I did other practices, right? And they didn't seem quite so romantic necessarily, but I read some books. Like, I didn't think I'd seen up close a lot of good marriages. I wanted to find out if anybody had any clues on how to do this right. I wanted to help Sherry find a job that she would find satisfying because she was going to come to Indianapolis and said I was going to Jacksonville. We had to find an apartment where we could live. I went looking for a church where we might be able to connect as a young couple and begin relationships in a place where neither one of us had ever been. Those are all practices that helped prepare our lives and prepare me and demonstrate actions I could take to prepare for what I didn't know was coming down the line. And that's exactly what we think of in terms of fasting and praying and what it could have been. And not only those. And so I wonder for you, to what extent have you thought about, to what extent have you on purpose done the things we typically call spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines, spiritual exercises, spiritual habits? Now, really, I don't like that word, spiritual, at the front of them, because it still lends us to a limited view of what we think, church people are supposed to do. When really, in some regards, any kind of purposeful practice of doing or not doing could be done for the purpose of connecting with God and connecting with others and growing our hearts. And so, let us not say spiritual practice as if it means like 5 things instead of almost anything but how you do it. But in our lives, it depends on kind of our upbringing. For many of us, we may not have ever seen a real practice other than most of us at one point were really drilled that your life should include a quiet time, which meant you better like getting up early, you better like reading, you better have something to say, and you probably have to like journaling too. And if you don't, you're not as good as the rest of us. And yet that's not the way everybody functions, and it's not the only way to do it. And the intentions might have been good, but what about other practices of rest and joy, of nature and of friendship? What about the kinds of things that have to do with my giving and my serving and my using of time, my being still or my purposeful movement, my being with others or my being alone? And so with this in mind, and especially because in this time we're about to lean into, and again, it may be something that you're familiar with. I mean, next Wednesday, not this coming, but next Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, and it's the beginning of the Lenten season. And typically in the history of the church, the Lenten season has been a season of doing practices, especially fasting, in relation or preparation to Easter that comes. And so this is a season of time, year after year in the church, around the world in many ways, where people would choose to fast or practice other practices for the 46-day period, take out the Sundays, a 40-day period from Ash Wednesday. And so I am so excited that this set of verses falls in this moment to be able to give us a moment to think about it, and I want you to think about it. But as you think about spiritual practices and you're doing them, whether you do them because it's Lent or in spite of the fact of that, whether you've done them before, I want you to think about them in this way. I put together this statement. We'll put this statement up on the wall about practices. And I'll show it to you from the scriptures as well. It says, practices are, so exercises, disciplines, we saw down here that you need to practice juggling in order to juggle. Practices are not the point. And they're not to earn points. The goal isn't to figure out which one of us is the best faster, the best giver, the best prayer. It's not about getting points with God because you do it. No, it's a response to our relationship to God. As Jesus has just pointed out, they're my friends and I'm the bridegroom. There's already a love relationship. But it's also should match the moment that we're currently in. And Jesus says, right now I'm a bridegroom who's with them. There'll be a day when I'm away, and then it'll be different. But you do or you don't do these practices not because they're the point, not because you're earning points, but to heal. That there's some ways that I could heal, and there's some ways that I could learn to follow Jesus that may be about getting rid of my small, shallow box. The ways I've always done it, the ways I've always thought, the ways that it has worked. That I want to grow in becoming more whole, and I want to grow in becoming more one. I need to heal of things that maybe I've been carrying since I was a child. And I need to stretch and be able to live, maybe in the midst of some fears and some concerns and some past failures. And so how do I put those things together? I want you to see where this first passage came from. If you flip over to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, just a couple of quick verses of what it means to not get points. Chapter 6, verse 1 of Matthew says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." We read this with a much more critical eye, as if like God's being mad about it. It's like, no, if your whole point of doing whatever you're doing, whatever practice it is to be seen, then when people see you, you got what you were looking for. You weren't looking for anything more than that. And then he gives us specific examples. Look, verse 2, "So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full." Verse 5, "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full." Skip down to verse 16. "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full." Again and again, and not in a way that, says, hey, if you ever tell anybody, then God's going to squash it out. That's not the point. That's not God. What the point is that these practices are not the point. And these practices aren't to earn points with God or other people. That's not why we're doing the practices. We choose to do the practices because of the relationship that we have and the moment that we are in and how it helps us heal and help others heal and follow Jesus in a way of love that is different than what just happens naturally for most of us. And so we come back to how Jesus specifically then teaches this. If you look back where we were in Luke Luke's chapter 5, it says, verse 36, and he told them this parable. No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Otherwise, they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. Will not match. When Sherry and I were writing letters, it matched our distance, but wanting our hearts to be one. It wouldn't have made any sense to match being physically together for the few moments that we had over those months by separating ourselves to prove that we wrote more letters or to impress anybody else with our letters. If the whole point of me doing this would have been 34 years ago to be able to tell somebody that I wrote 100 letters, then it would have been a waste of time and kind of corrupt in terms of our marriage. I'm using our marriage to prove I'm something to you instead of just saying like, no, this is what happened. Thinking cool, not thinking cool. Here's what it is. Because the point wasn't to be seen. The point wasn't to earn points. The point was, this was the way to pursue wholeness and oneness. And Jesus goes on to say, no one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the new wine will burst the skins and the wine will run out and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured in new wineskins. We'll save that last verse for next week. But Jesus is communicating that your container will dictate how the new wine, the Spirit of God, the life of God, the love of God, the healing of God, the world, the love that God is flowing through you, like that will be dictated by the container that you're taking it in. And the challenge for some of us is, I really believe God wants you to be able to heal in some ways that you haven't yet been able to heal, but you're not ready to receive that love or believe that that could happen because you're still holding it to an old box of how it happened and whose fault it was and whether I'm right and who should forgive. That God wants to use us beyond ourselves to love some people that we don't even feel safe loving, our enemies in some way, those who are least like us. But we've been so taught that they're unclean and they're the problem and we better stay away from them if we're going to stay holy, that we've missed that what God is asking us to do is practice the very things that would change your container. You may have to lay it down as Peter or Simon laid down his boat to go out into the deep with Jesus, literally and figuratively. Or Levi, how he laid down his tax collector's booth. They laid down their wooden boxes to go take on life in a way that they thought they might have known, but they would have to come to. But it's the question for all of us. Would we learn to practice fasting, doing without in some way, consuming in some way, giving, serving, resting, or celebrating? Being still. And for some of us, it's what is it that's hardest for you? Where is it that you feel so in control when you're doing that the hardest thing for you to do is to do nothing and then not hear a message in the back of your head, you lazy buzzard? And so you just can't. So even when you go, well, I'm not going to watch TV, but I'm going to fill it full of reading the Bible. Well, great, maybe. Or maybe just like turn everything off so that you're getting less hateful news and you're just being still. And maybe looking out the window and seeing the creation that God has for you. And that wouldn't be failure either, because that may be exactly for your moment what comes out of the relationship. That it's not an achievement contest because nobody's keeping score. And if they are, then you're playing a different game. And so what would it mean for us to take this opportunity ahead? And then, as Brandy shared, I had skipped past it last time on purpose, making much of it. Scoot back to verses 15 and 16. Jesus doesn't just teach how you should think about practices, teach about needing to put this new bubbly life wine into new wineskins, that we should see ourselves in relationship to God and match the moment. He also models it. Let me read those verses again in case you didn't get them when she was talking to the kids. Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. And I think, again, we almost have to make sure we shift our box when it comes to prayer. So, in other words, in a time when Jesus has thousands coming to him in need, he on purpose says, in this moment of oneness with my Father, where I am the vehicle of the Father to teach and to heal, what am I going to do? In the times that I'm overwhelmed by people, I'm going to, on purpose, find alone time to balance it out. In a time where people can't wait to hear what I'm teaching, and they're going to challenge what I'm teaching, and I'm going to say all kinds of words in all kinds of ways, I'm going to get alone and listen to the Father, or just be with the Father, or maybe say, hey, Father, this is what I'm thinking about saying next week. In a time when everything in me is being poured out and drained from me so that love could come out of me, healing could come out of me, I'm going to go be alone and receive from God the filling of the love and the strength and the renewal so that I am pouring out. That Jesus demonstrates that very thing. I'm going to, on purpose, participate in practices, exercises, habits that come out of my relationship with the Father and the moment of what I'm doing right now. I'm going to thoughtfully choose to do or not do based on what God's asking of me and what the people around me need. And so, looking forward, as we have like a week and a half between now and that day, and you don't have to start anything on that day. Again, it doesn't have to be your motivation at all, but I just say it's a great excuse. If we started on Ash Wednesday, what might you do or stop doing? How might you read or listen or write? But also, how might you be present? What would it be to make one phone call a day for a handful of days, or 40 days, or 100 days, but for one day or 10 days, to just see how people are, even if they don't answer and you just leave a message? What would it mean for you to put $5 in your pocket each day and say, before I eat dinner, I'm going to find someone to give this to or to spend this on? What would it mean instead to say, I'm going to take a couple of $100, and by the time these 46 days are over, I'm going to decide where there's an organization or a group or a human being who God brings in my path, and I've already set aside, this is going to them, whatever they need. How would it change how you see people? How would it change how you see you? Nothing wrong with reading a little more of the Bible. Nothing wrong with setting aside eating chocolate or whatever crazy things we typically do. But it's not really the point of the practices. The point of fasting and praying and giving, the point of celebrating and experiencing joy, the point of spending time and not, of movement and stillness, the point of all of them is not so that you're awesome at it, and it's not so that you get points for it. It's because it's the reaction of your relationship with God changing your container to match the moment that you are in, so that you can take the next step of healing from your grief, of overcoming your fear, of changing how you see people who you've seen as threats, of exchanging old hurts so that you could be more whole and more one with God and others could become more whole. And if that was done, what stories we have to tell on Easter Sunday of what it means to lay down our lives for our friends in love, even if it looks like punishment, because somehow there's life that's greater than death. God, will you challenge us, inspire us, love us into considering these things that maybe we're good at, maybe we're not, maybe we've tried, maybe we're not, maybe we thought were never for us, maybe we think have been misused by other people, but in this moment, based on being your children who are your delight, your beloved kids, will you help us consider how we would change the rhythms of our lives, the actions of our lives, Maybe for some of us doing a whole lot less or differently. Maybe for some of us doing a whole lot more. Maybe for some of us failing more often. Will you give us a sense of grace that we don't take on doing something 100% and again being critical when we're not doing it exactly right because we're doing something new? Will you help us not keep points on ourselves? Will you help us not keep points on one another, but instead find this as a way of living out being your disciple, healing and following in your kingdom way of love together with you? We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let's stand and sing, I Am Thine, O Lord, hymn number 504.